All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's CNCF webinar, Intro to Harbor. I'm Chris Short, CNCF Ambassador and Principal Product Marketing Manager at Ansible. I'd like to thank everyone who is joining us today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. During the webinar, you're not able to talk as an attendee. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll get to as many at the end as we can. The session is being recorded and will be sent out afterwards along with a link to the presentation. With that, I'll hand it over to kick off today's presentation.
Hey, thanks, Chris. So I will be talking about Harbor. I'm James. I work on the Harbor team here at VMware. I represent a team of 8 or 9 really tremendous engineers that have created, obviously, a very cool project. So I'm grateful for them and wanted to give them a shout out. So I'll be talking about Harbor and what it is. Obviously, as Chris mentioned, it is a container registry. The presentation is about 20 to 25 slides, maybe 30. I'll get through it pretty quickly, and then we'll get to a demo. But before we get too far and start talking about all the different features and functionality and how the project started, I just kind of wanted to share the mission statement that we have for Harbor, because that really kind of sets the stage for the different things that we add to the project as it progresses. So about a year ago or so, we all sat down and decided, well, what are we going to really focus on? What do we want to do over the next 12, 18, 24 months? And this is sort of what came out of that. So Harbor is a cloud-native registry, obviously. It originally focused on just images, and as I'll talk about in a little while, now we do Helm chart support as well. But the focus, the 3 pillars of the project are storing, signing, and scanning content. And you'll sort of see that that interwoven throughout this presentation. And if you start tinkering with the project, you'll see as well that we've really put our focus on those 3 areas. And of course, as time progresses, we may sort of tweak this mission statement and start adding functionality that lies outside of that. But that's what we've decided to really focus on here as Harbor becomes a more mature project as time progresses. So for the agenda today, this looks really long. I'm a little bit allergic to slides, as I'm sure many of you are who are technical, but I do kind of want to cover the basis here before we get too far. So I'll do a Containers 101. I'm completely confident everyone on this call doesn't need this, but I do use this presentation in other formats, and it always helps when there's 1 or 2 folks who are quietly sitting in the corner and perhaps they need a slight refresher. We'll talk about an intro to Harbor, discuss where it came from, why we built it, where it is today. And then 3, 4, 5, and 6, we'll dive into the features of the project as it exists today. And then I'll cover a couple of different things, do a demo, and then discuss the roadmap as well. And feel free to ask any questions. Jonas, as Chris mentioned, is on the phone. He's my colleague here. We work on open source in the Cloud Native team, and he's happy to chime in while I'm presenting. So let's get started. Containers 101. This is super high level, a 30,000, 40,000 foot view of what a container image is. But for those that are either rusty or are not completely familiar, welcome. And I would define a container as sort of a hermetically sealed entity that contains inside of it all the tooling, libraries, and the application artifacts that are needed to run an application. Right? That's a really simple definition that most people seem to grasp, even C-level folks who aren't too technical. This diagram is pretty busy, right? Harbor lives in the upper right-hand corner. I'll just try to keep it as simple as possible. Harbor is the registry in the upper right-hand corner, right? And a container and an image, the subtle difference is that one is running at a container, and the image is what is actually running. The guiding principle here for Harbor is that it's in the middle of this pipeline of software development, right? So you have, for example, on the bottom left-hand corner, you may have a developer and his or her laptop. You start working with containers, you start building an application, and when it looks good, you push it into the middle, which in this graphic is Harbor. And then on the other side, maybe it's a CI pipeline, a Kubernetes cluster, or whatever. Maybe another developer is sitting on the bottom right-hand corner here, and they need to take that image and start doing something with it, whether it's running tests, putting the container into production, et cetera. And so what they do is they pull the image out of the registry, which is Harbor. So again, at a very high level, what Harbor is doing, what a container registry does, is it stores images, right? And of course, the scanning and the signing we'll talk about in a little bit of detail in the further slides. But that's how Harbor exists in the sort of container ecosystem and why it exists. So what about Harbor? Let's dive in a little bit, go down to maybe 25,000 feet. So Harbor was started in 2014. It's hard to believe it's been that long. The time has definitely flown. As an internal R&D project out of China, actually, from our China team. And it started as somebody internally complaining that they didn't have a place to put Docker containers, and the creator of the project, Henry, sitting down and hammering out some code to change that scenario. Right, so it eventually became a project that, and you'll see it, I'll show you a graphic here in a little while, it became an internal, sort of an internal incubation project, and then it was open source, and the rest is history. Again, we do container images, and we do Helm charts, right? So the Helm chart, I'll kind of differentiate here. We do both storing Helm charts on Harbor, and we also are working on running Harbor as a Helm chart on Kubernetes. So when I say Helm chart, it could be one or the other. In this particular bullet, what I'm talking about is storing Helm charts on Harbor. One of the pros, the strong points of having Harbor as sort of your container registry is it doesn't matter where you run it. The user interaction, the user interface is identical. This is a little bit different from using GCP and their container registry, Azure, Amazon has one. Maybe you're using Docker Hub. Harbor kind of brings to bear the fact that regardless of where you run Harbor, on-prem or off-prem, the user experience is the same, and our users really like that. It's Apache version 2, obviously, and I'm sure we were accepted as a sandbox project in July, and it's been really, really a positive experience. We've had a lot of contribution increases, whether by GitHub issues or folks actually writing code, doing PRs, code reviews. It's been there's definitely been an uptick in activity since. So graphically, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This is just sort of a timeline that I keep up to date here, and I generally share. You can probably read it offline, but it again started as a very small project in 2014, and now 4 years and a couple of months later, we're part of the CNCF, and it's a pretty popular project, and we're a lot of folks that are hopping in and working to make the project better. More open source stats here. I won't dive into the details, but again, it's been a lot of increase in contributions. So let's talk about Harbor here in terms of concrete features and what it does and so on. Harbor was built as a multi-tenanted project from the beginning, right? So if you go and download Docker distribution version 2, this isn't something that comes out of the box. This is a Harbor feature that if you're a developer A and you own project A on Harbor, and your neighbor at work has project B and is developer B, they can't see what's going on in each of their projects unless permissions are explicitly shared. This ties in very nicely with LDAP groups and role-based access control, which is one of the key principles of Harbor, meaning that you have to explicitly give somebody access, or a group, an LDAP group or an Active Directory group access, so that they can see or even push images to your project. Some of the other features are security and vulnerability analysis. We'll talk about that in lots of details, but it leverages Claire to scan your images. Image replication, again, I'll talk about that as well, but the idea here is that Harbor Registry A can automatically replicate images to Harbor Registry B with no intervention on your part once you've set up the replication rules. From a day 2 ops experience, I think that everything runs in containers. That's sort of irrelevant if you're using it. If you're certainly doing development on it, perhaps it does make a little bit of a difference. And as you can see here in this diagram, we're using some off-the-shelf components, and we're tying it all together with sort of the Harbor pieces, which are blue. So I'll go over this briefly, but I think that it's worth mentioning that this is a good diagram to dive into if you're going to either leverage or start doing development on Harbor. This is very valuable. It gives you a really good view of all the different pieces that are moving in this puzzle. At the bottom in the green, we have the persistence layer, right? So Postgres is our database. It used to be a combination of different databases. But, sorry, can you still see my screen?
No.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. Postgres is the database. We leverage Redis. For the bigger components that we use in terms of the different registry-like components or container-like components, you have Docker distribution version 2 here on the bottom right. The vulnerability scanning is Claire, which is a CoreOS project. And the trusted content is another CNCF project, Notary. The blue piece is sort of again, the magic part that Harbor uses to glue everything together. So the core services, for example, API, it's what you interface with when you use the user interface, the UI. It provides a layer that will block pushes and pulls if vulnerability scans are failing. It's how you pretty much how you control Harbor at a high level, right? You configure your replication and so on in this particular layer of stack. On the right-hand side, you'll see that we have two quote-unquote packaging pieces to this puzzle. One is Docker. Docker Compose is perhaps the most prevalent way to deploy Harbor today. Helm chart is definitely kind of the way of the future and what we're focusing on doing. We developed it and deployed it. It shipped it in version 1.6, which happened a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago. It's definitely getting better in every release. So kind of a youngish part of the project, but we're polishing it up as we go. The last thing I'll say at the bottom is storage. You can pretty much bring your own storage. You do whatever you want. You can run it on, if you run Harbor on AWS, you can use S3. If you're doing it on-prem, you can use Minio. File storage works, block storage. If you're an SRE, it's pretty easy to kind of get all these things together and make it work on whatever storage backend you want. Ceph as well. I'll skip over this, but we do have a lot of users. So it's not a baby project. It's been around quite a while. Some of these users literally have millions of container images. So lots of users that are leveraging Harbor. Image consistency. So this, let's kind of take a step back and look at containers. Harbor out. Ignore Harbor for a moment and trying to think about some of the issues that containers have. Right. First of all, we'll look at a Docker file here at the top where you have, from Ubuntu, you're going to use apt to install Python, and then you go and you add your Java application to the container, right? So you can do this, and if you know what you're doing, if you've been doing it a long time, great. You'll probably avoid all the small pitfalls, all the things that could happen if you're sort of new to the container ecosystem. But there are challenges here if you're not careful, right? If you go and build the Docker file in green today, and then tomorrow you go and do it in your QA environment, and the QA, the pipeline is going and building this Docker file as part of the process. There's a possibility that the Ubuntu latest tag has changed, or that Ubuntu 14.04 became Ubuntu 14.04.1, right? There's also a very good likelihood that your apt command is actually pulling something different. It's not deterministic. The packages may not be identical. And of course, every time you do an add to a container, unless you're absolutely 100% sure that the artifact has not changed, it could have changed, right? So again, these are all things you can address if you're careful and you know how to set this up, and you're very prudent from getting your pipeline from point A to point B. But Harbor brings this idea of a replication feature to the table, and this is not a silver bullet. You should still do containers right, and there are again a lot of little things you have to be careful about. But it does allow you to kind of do this pipeline from point A to point B, where you're going from a dev environment to QA, staging, and prod with all of these different registries. Right? Most of our larger users have a container registry for dev, one for QA, one for staging, one for prod. It allows you to replicate images from point A to point B and ensure that the images themselves are unchanged throughout this pipeline, throughout this process. Right, and I'll point out, this slide is very high level, but I'll point out that the initial application, you can set policies like filtering on labels or on tags or on specific projects. And then very similar to a ZFS send, for example, where only changed blocks are sent on a second send, on a second replication, Harbor will intelligently choose only the things that have changed from point A to point B, or rather from time A to time B, from the initial replication to the second replication. And to put kind of a picture behind what I was just discussing, here you have, and this is actually a graphic that we worked on with a user who's been using Harbor for a very long time. So this is a real world scenario. And we have a dev registry where a bunch of developers are pushing images, pulling images, making changes. And then once things are get to the point where the developers feel confident, they'll actually push the images to a test registry and then manually push it to staging and production. And you can imagine this caused some heartaches. Right? So when Harbor's replication feature came along, And they could automate this pipeline where when an image is, hit in the dev registry, when an image goes into a special project called completed, for example, it'll get pushed to test. And once the CI pipeline feels that the tests have all passed, it'll put it in another project, and then it'll get pushed to staging and production and so on. This makes an SRE's life very easy, right? And it also ensures that the quote unquote binary format, right? And I use that loosely, so please don't send me any hate mail. The binary format, the actual blob, the hermetically sealed container is unchanged from point A to point B. And so it does solve some issues in these sorts of more complex situations. I'll pause here for a quick gulp of coffee and any questions if there are any. Okay. I guess since Jonas didn't stop me, we're probably good.
No, hold on. We actually do have a few questions here. So the first one is from David Carlson. Can Harbor act as a caching proxy towards external repositories?
Not today. That's on our very short list of things that are highly sought after. It's on the last slide where I mentioned the payload for hopefully the next release. But there's a pretty popular GitHub issue where folks are talking about that, and it's high on our list to do.
Excellent, thank you. Got one more here from Dimitro. Does Harbor support Docker images for Windows?
Yes, it does. We've done some testing on it, and I have not personally tested it, but I've been told that it works.
Great. We got one more coming in here from Nagaraj. How is it similar? How is Harbor similar or different from Docker Trusted Registry?
Well, Docker Trusted Registry, to the best of my knowledge, is a commercial project, and it's not based on Docker Distribution version 2. So if I go back here to this slide, this component right here is Docker Distribution version 2, right? It's sort of the workhorse in the Harbor stack. DTR, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, is not leveraging Docker Distribution 2. Is leveraging a completely different code base, and it's their productized offering for container registry. And certainly, it has features that Harbor does not have yet. I've heard very good things about it, but it is fundamentally different at its core.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Those are great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So got a few more. Well, we got two more here if you're okay with those, or do you want to keep those for later?
Yeah, but let's try it on a little bit longer, and I'll need another coffee break. All right, so global replication. This is perhaps the second most popular use case for the replication feature. Certainly, this is not something everybody needs to do, but it is not uncommon to have development teams in different parts of the world, and individuals using Harbor will generally enable replication to more geo-appropriate sites. Obviously, this slide right here, I think, is it's just trying to illustrate the point, but we certainly have users that are using Harbor to replicate from India to the US and to Europe, and it just sort of does everything in the background. It's sort of a CDN-like topology. I'm not going out on a limb here and saying that Harbor provides a CDN for container images, but it is perhaps CDN-like, and this is something that is being used with Harbor right now. All right, image security. So there's two concepts related to security here, and they're different, but they're both important. Number one is security at sort of the Harbor level, the role-based access control. We touched on that briefly. And then the second part of this is container security, right? And by that I mean vulnerability scanning, and I also mean provenance of images. So we'll go through this relatively quickly here. RBAC is what this slide is talking about, and in this particular instance, all we mean is different people should have different permissions. Right? A developer who's working on a specific application may or may not need read-write access, while QA is unlikely to be doing coding work on that software product itself, and so they would only have read-only access to a registry project. As an example, you can tie this to individual identities in LDAP to a role in Harbor, or you can tie groups of users, LDAP groups of users to role in Harbor, LDAP or AD, as you see at the bottom. This is a graphical way of looking at that. The box on the right, sort of connotes different container images, Go, Nginx, whatever it may be. You have developers who are pushing and pulling to that quote unquote box. That collection of images lives in a specific project. A guest may only have Docker pull access to those images, while an admin at the bottom, and I haven't talked about that much, but an admin really least privilege is sort of the best idea here. An admin is really just there to configure Harbor, and you don't want a day-to-day user leveraging admin privileges. So now kind of switching gears to the container piece of the puzzle. Number one is making sure that images are not changed. So I'm a developer, I push an image, I sign it using my private key, and I want to make sure that when another developer grabs my image, it's not changed, right? And that is Notary, and that is what we leverage in the Harbor stack to make that happen. We'll talk about that more in 1 second. The second is vulnerability scanning, obviously looking inside of a container and trying to figure out and make sure that nothing has been identified as potentially vulnerable before something goes into production. So this is the graphical representation of Notary. This is nothing special. This is exactly what it would work like or even look like if you were to deploy Docker Distribution version 2 and Notary separately and sort of integrate them together. What you have is the creator on the left-hand side, and here she is going to push a tag, push a container image, and assign the manifest and send it to Notary, right? While on the other side of the puzzle, the consumer, the yellow on the right, is responsible for pulling the image using the digest that was created. And so the Notary piece is at the top, and it's responsible for the signing piece. In terms of vulnerability scanning, we use Claire, as I mentioned. Some of the interesting things about Claire in the Harbor context is that you can set a threshold, right? So an SRE may say, hey, great, create your images, it passes QA, I'll push it, but no problem. But if overnight, as an example, Harbor pulls vulnerability data from, I don't know, Alpine, and we realize that at 8 o'clock in the morning before an image is used in a production application or production deployment, that all of a sudden a new CVE was identified and it was a high importance, you can actually prevent those images from being pulled, right? So that adds a little bit of comfort. A lot of our users leverage this feature. They worry a little bit less knowing that those images are not going to be used in production if there is something identified that's potentially problematic. Claire itself uses static analysis. Again, it looks inside at the bits of the actual packages inside of the container and tries to determine if there's a problem. Just to clarify this, because there are a lot of questions on GitHub, Slack, and folks that I talk to, Harbor team does not, we don't post or publish vulnerability data. Again, so Claire is the component we're using here, and Claire will pull once a night security data from major vendors, including NIST. So the actual databases are being updated by the distributions themselves. This is what it looks like. I won't dive into this because there's a live demo coming up at the end. The only thing I'll point out here, this is not related to Claire, but Notary is this image assigned, right? And I actually don't have Notary running in my live environment, so this will show up as an X. But I'll show you the rest of the pieces here in the live demo. 2 more topics, and then we'll get to the live demo. I appreciate everyone's patience. Image distribution. So this is not Harbor specific, right? I think if you run any sort of a container registry in production that's being actually used heavily between developers and QA and pipelines and Kubernetes clusters pulling images, if it has enough traffic, there's going to be a contention on the network and on the disks, right? Sure, you can design something to scale out, Docker distribution. I mean, we don't. The claim to fame here is not that we've solved an unsolved problem, but rather that we've made it easier. What we do here there's lots and lots of permutations and combinations available here, right? But replication in this particular context allows individuals to get creative about how they spread the load, right? And by load, I mean the actual use, the heavy use against the container registry. So this is perhaps the most simple example whereby developers are hitting a main Harbor node, right? The green one at the top, pushing images as necessary, and then all the other work that's being done is generally pull, right? Again, QA, CI, and possibly putting things into a production Kubernetes cluster as an example. Those are all activities that are pulling images, and that can be spread across multiple Harbor nodes using replication, right? That's use case number one. And use case number two we already talked about in a previous graphic, which is putting things closer to the destination, whereby a Kubernetes node, for example, doesn't have to pull gigs and gigs across a couple of continents and competing with it, trying to outpace the speed of light. So putting things closer is always better. So replication, as I was putting the slide together, I thought, well, we should really have a nice wiki page on this where we talk about multiple different architectures we've seen. But this is, again, perhaps the most simple. And there's all sorts of things that you can do, perhaps having two Harbor nodes, load balancing at the top, whatever it may be, to make this even more robust as necessary. I'll stop for questions, Jonas, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we got a bunch of them here.
Okay.
So the first one is from Gabrielle Rosca. Can replication of images go between dev to QA to prod in the same Harbor server?
No, but no, it cannot. But in that case, for example, what would happen is part of your CI pipeline or QA, perhaps your QA's automation, they would, if a test passes, they would tag an image that has passed and quote unquote push it to the same Harbor node. And what happens is if you have a Harbor node and it has an image Alpine, and then you go and you tag it and you call it Alpine and the tag is new, and then you would do a Docker push, Harbor is intelligent enough to know, hey, wait a minute, I already have this image, it's identical, I'm just going to add a metadata tag and not actually push any data. There's actually no transfer of actual image bits in that process. So I guess my point is you don't need replication in that use case. You would just need tooling to promote things from one project to another if we're only talking about one Harbor node.
Cool. So there are a few CI/CD questions here that I think would fit well into this. The first one here is, let me find it here, from Babatunde. Can Harbor integrate with VRA to automate CI/CD as opposed to CodeStream?
I don't know.
Okay.
I want to be honest. I don't know. I would please ping me on GitHub or Slack. I don't want to leave you hanging, and I will find out for you.
Sounds good. Next one here. Let me find it here. What process do you suggest for Jenkins builds storing images to Harbor? This is from Ismail.
Is there, can we be a tiny bit more specific? Maybe we can ask for some more clarification and then come back to the clarification part. Okay.
That sounds good.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if you're talking about like at a macro level how to store the images, or if there's a plugin, or perhaps a little bit more context.
Sounds good. All right. So let's talk about Claire for a little bit here. What if an image is detected to be, this is from Mark Kozam. What if an image is detected to be vulnerable after a new CVE is published? Does Harbor do anything like notifications or something like that? So we know that this now vulnerable image is already running in production?
No, that's great feedback, and we're fully aware of it. We've had a couple of other folks ask for that. So there is no notification aside from manually going into the UI and looking. So there's a moderately easy way for us to do this, but we don't have it quite yet. So it's on the list of things we want to do for sure.
Okay. And from AJ Kansei, can Harbor be integrated with other security tools apart from Claire?
Not today. However, after joining the CNCF, we have been approached by a number of vendors that build tools to scan container images, and so part of the exercise in now that we're part of the CNCF is refactoring a lot of code and sort of making it more modular. And then this is a process that all mature open source projects go through, as there's an uptick in adoption. So the answer is no, but we are working with some folks who are interested in doing this. So I suspect the answer will be yes in the next, maybe 6 to 12 months for sure.
Okay. One last one for now. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll add one more thing about that. If there is something you're interested in seeing, please ping me on GitHub just so that we can track it. So that we're sure that when we do modularize Harbor, that we do it in a way that, perhaps insert your favorite tool here would fit nicely with the architecture of Harbor. So if you could share some more information, please send it to me, and I'm happy to chat with you about it.
Great. So last one here for now, and then we'll continue on from Gabriel Rosca. Is it common practice for a security group to sign the images, or is that done by someone else?
What I will say is that most of the use cases that I have seen involve CI/CD signing images, so that once it passes tests, we are confident that what's running in production is actually what came out of the pipeline. That's what I've seen most common. I've not seen the security team sign images, but honestly, I can think of maybe 6 customers that are using the signing feature in production on a daily basis, and so I don't have a whole lot of data points to share here.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, great questions, fantastic questions. Let's see here. All right, so only a couple more things here to mention in terms of HA. So HA is a complex problem, right? This is perhaps the most common thing that we're asked about on GitHub. And we definitely want to do HA, right? So I think that the short answer is we're working on the chart, the Helm chart, and I think that the Helm chart will probably will get us 80% of the way there. The thing about HA, just in general, and this is certainly not me making excuses, but just acknowledging the complexity of something like this, is that everybody's environment is different, right? You have shared storage, you are using local storage, you have a load balancer, is it kind of is it an F5, is it an NGINX, is it Cisco, load balancer, all sorts of different pieces here that make the concept of doing HA a little bit more complex than it would be if this wasn't an infrastructure level open source project. But again, I think that the Helm chart will get us really to a comfortable place where most users are likely satisfied with the capabilities that come with Harbor running on top of Kubernetes. Alternatively, or perhaps what I said in tandem, we are looking at features like clustering. Right? This is a much bigger change from a code perspective, but I think that I'm sure Chris agrees with me. As a Red Hatter, etcd is beautiful, right? So you kind of just point a bunch of nodes at each other, and you have this cluster, and you're confident that it's strongly consistent using graphs, and so on and so forth. It'd be nice to add that sort of feature to Harbor. We'll talk about the roadmap here in a little while. Certainly, users have asked for this before. It would make it easy to just take a bunch of Harbor nodes and have them talk to each other and share metadata and transfer, labels and so on and so forth, and configuration. So that is something that we've certainly been looking at, and I think that that's maybe perhaps the last piece of the puzzle for having high availability in this environment. All right, so demo. Let's see here. Oh, questions popped up here. Can you see my screen, Jonas?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So the first thing I'll say here is that, and that's why I'll kind of breeze through the demo here and just kind of give you a quick walkthrough. You can use this yourself, demo.goharbor.io, and then you can just click to sign up for an account, go through the process, and you'll have access to this environment. And so you'll see here that there are actually, this environment will reset every couple of days. So whatever images you put here, please don't, put them in production, or at least have them somewhere else. But all the, most of these projects are created by users who are playing with the platform. So when you log in, you get a list of projects. Again, this is sort of the multi-tenant principle here, where I'm an admin, so I can see all the projects. But if I were to log in as, a specific user, I would only see the projects that I have access to. Okay. A couple data points here in terms of, the number of projects and repos and so on. A quick glance at how much storage is available. And we'll go through these one at a time here in just a second. Logs is obviously gives you access to data about who pushed, who pulled, and what sort of changes were made in the UI. Here we have our users. You can see again bunch of folks who are just playing with the environment. You can make a user an admin if you need to. Then he or she will have access to everything. Registries is pretty straightforward here. Here we define registries other than what we're logged into. So for demonstration purposes, I put a demo2 endpoint here. Demo2 doesn't exist. If it did, I would then be able to go into the replication section and define a replication rule that says, hey, listen, everything inside of my webinar project will get replicated to demo2, right? And then I'll be able to trigger this manually if I need to. Right? You can also trigger scheduled or immediately, so that if I do a push to the webinar project, it will automatically get replicated to demo2.goharbor.io. Okay. So again, this node doesn't exist, unfortunately, but you can see here that there are a bunch of errors, obviously, because it doesn't exist, this node. But that's how easy it is to create replication. So if you had an environment, as I showed in the slide, that had the big green harbor at the top and a bunch of smaller harbors, for geolocality at the bottom, we just have to create a bunch of registries and set up the rules to replicate them. So it's a one-time thing. Configuration is also pretty straightforward. You can either auth by LDAP or database. We allow self-registration, so please feel free, again, demo.goharbor.io. Emails, excuse me, I guess I haven't had enough coffee. Emails to send you alerts for different things. System settings, labels. Labels is kind of a new thing. We may be moving this. I'm not sure. It makes a whole lot of sense to put it in the label section under configuration. But you can add all sorts of things here, the name, the color, etc. So very Gmail-like. And then vulnerabilities, you can hit scan now, right? So I'll just let Claire run in the background and start scanning images, and it'll scan all the new images that I have pushed since I set up the last scan. Okay. So I'll show you here real quick. I mentioned during the presentation, again, signed is an X, which means I don't have notary, right? Vulnerability is the piece here that most of our folks rely on when they're putting things into production. So in this case, you see there is one high vulnerability identified and a bunch of other, lower ones, 5 medium and 6 low. So here I'm digging into project 1 on Redis. And you can actually see the CVE data that came from this particular vendor. In this case, this is an Ubuntu image that's coming from Canonical. And I can actually click through. Let's see if we can find the high one. There we go. So let's see here. You can click it. It'll take you to the security. So APT mishandles GPG signatures, signature verification. Lovely. So in this particular case, if you go to project and you go to configuration, prevent vulnerable images from running. So here we're going to put, hey, anything over medium, I don't trust it. I don't want to run this thing. So here, the core components of Harbor will block the Docker pull for any images that have a high vulnerability. In this case, Redis would fail for a Docker pull. Let's see, a couple things. Helm chart is broken in this build. I'm sorry. This is my fault. I pushed a new release of this recently, and Helm the chart piece is not working. But Helm charts will appear here. Members are actual individuals who belong to the project, right? So again, unless you're in a project or you're an admin, you won't see the project. You can set up replication from here, labels, logs, and again, you can do some configuration specific to that project. The last thing I'll mention is that projects can be public or private. So if you log out of this, you'll see that there's a couple of repos that I created here for the webinar, excuse me. And because this project is public, you can actually see them on the list here. Okay. So that's the demo. I encourage you to play with it. I think that's the best way to learn. At least that's the best way I learned. And certainly it'll give you a pretty good idea of what Harbor is and how it works. 2 or 3 more slides here, and we're done. That was the meat and potatoes of the presentation. Roadmap, just to confirm, Jonas, you can see my screen?
Yep.
Great. 1.7 is en route. You can click the link here, and I'll share this prezo to see the different features that we're working on for 1.7. 1.7 should land sometime at end of the year, I suppose. 1.8 is still up for grabs. So, we're really making a huge emphasis on ensuring that the community has really strong input over the direction of the project. Please chime in on GitHub, particularly open an issue. For example, the question on doing it as a proxy or a cache for, say, Docker Hub, very popular. And the only way that we know that people really, really want this is if you tell us. So please do ping us on GitHub. These are the things that are just, and this is a short list. There's a lot of things that should appear here, but I don't like slides with a terrible amount of text. Quotas, lifecycle management of Harbor via Helm charts. Image proxying and caching is exactly what we were asked about. So, the idea to say, hey, look, I only want my developers to pull from Harbor, but there are images that live on Docker Hub that I need to be able to provide for them. So I want Harbor to sort of be that intermediary. That's a very popular feature request. Token-based authentication. The clustering is a big one. I think that eventually that will probably come to fruition, but it may be a while. Improved RBAC and multi-tenancy. By that I mean, we've had requests for adding an extra layer of multi-tenancy. So instead of just having projects, you would have a tenant and a project, whereby a tenant, for example, would be a line of business, and a project would be individual, projects that the line of business was working on, as an example. Harbor Kettle, we have a community contributor that wrote a Harbor CLI tool, and we're trying to kind of bring that under the umbrella of the community and really polish it up and make it part of the core project. And tags, just improving tags and lifecycle management. Please contribute if you can. We're very friendly. I would say this is probably one of the lower barrier projects to contribute to. If you look at Kubernetes as an example, there's hundreds and hundreds of commits a day. Harbor has a much more manageable amount. So if you want to contribute, please, documentation. We're seeing a lot of folks that are chiming in there, wrangling issues, whatever it may be. If you feel comfortable, please reach out. I'm happy to walk you through the process. Slack is probably a good way to get me, real time, and I'm always on it. And the last thing I'll say is ping us. GitHub is /GoHarbor. That's the org name. GoHarbor.io. And ping us on the CNCF Slack, either the Harbor channel or their Harbor Dev channel. And I sort of live there. So if you, again, if you want to contribute something or you have a question, please feel free to bring me in. I'm happy to help however I can. So should we dive into the last bit of questions?
Let's do it. We got a bunch of them here.
Okay.
And just a correction on that last slide, it's Harbor and not Harbor in the channel there or on Slack.
Yes. Yes, it is. Thank you.
All right, so let's dive into a few questions regarding Kubernetes here. The first one is from Sanjeev. How is Harbor RBAC tied to or aligned with Kubernetes RBAC roles and bindings? Yeah,
0 today, but we actually have an organization inside of VMware anyway, who wants to do this, and I suspect we'll probably start seeing some contributions for that particular alignment sooner than later. But I think that is sort of the goal, is to at least offer that as a potential integration.
Great. I think we had another one. Yeah, that was the same one. So this is from K. Chandra Sekar. If I integrate Harbor in my Kubernetes cluster, then can I eliminate the use of the federated API to pull or use images from other clusters, from another region?
I don't know. Ping me on GitHub and I'll get you an answer. I don't know, honestly.
Cool. Quick question here from Dave. Will Harbor ever be able to act as an NPM registry?
That's a great question. Maybe. I think that our focus right now is container, registry, and Helm chart, only because when we wrote our mission statement, there was only 8 of us. I would love to see Harbor be a sort of an artifact store for all sorts of things, including NPM, maybe RPMs, and deb packages, and perhaps more importantly is builds, right? Is taking builds and storing them in an immutable manner for, I don't know, for business purposes. So I am super open to that idea. I would love to see some work done in that space, but right now it's not there. But hopefully one day.
Great. Let's see. So this is from Ismo. He asked about Jenkins before. So adding on to the Jenkins question before, is there a plugin or some other easy way to store images from Jenkins?
Okay, so then that would be the artifact store question that we just discussed. No, there's no way to store built images or built artifacts today, aside from container images. So there's no plugin. I guess the easiest way to do it, if you're doing a CI pipeline, is just to spit out the final image into a specific project inside of Harbor, but we can't store anything else.
Cool. From Rajesh here, what's the underlying replication mechanism used for Harbor? Is it rsync or something else?
No, I mean, I don't want to say it's custom. That sounds like proprietary software. It's just a replication that we built using a Docker push and pull. However, I caveat that by saying that we can't replicate to, say, Docker distribution version 2. It can only replicate to and from Harbor today. We didn't do that for lock-in or any reason. We just haven't added the functionality to pull and push to other registries. But it is something that a lot of folks have asked for, and we'll definitely get to it sooner or later. So that's sort of part of the image caching / proxying that I was mentioning. Eventually, we'd like to be able to push and pull to other registries, replicate to other registries.
Cool. You showed some configuration settings earlier in the demo here. Can Harbor be configured using only code like YAML or JSON, or is it only by interacting with the UI?
No, it's fully API driven. The UI is an Angular app using Clarity, the UI framework. Everything is driven by an API. Part of the Harbor Kettle tool that I was talking about will get us there to the point where it's CLI driven. But we have a lot of users who have written custom tooling to expire older tags or do reporting outside of the UI to show the life cycle of images or whatever it may be. So no, it can definitely be configured outside of the UI.
Okay, cool. From Mark here, I missed it if you said it, but will you contribute your chart to the Helm chart repo?
Yeah, definitely. We will. We have kept it out of there because it's just maturing so quickly. But we will. The goal is absolutely to contribute it to the Helm chart repo.
Great. And we've got two questions here regarding Quay. So from K. Chandra, Sikar, and Naga. How is Harbor different from CoreOS Quay registry, and can we replace Quay with Harbor?
How is it different? I mean, one is a product that is sold. Yeah, I've used Quay. It has a couple of things we don't have right now, such as webhooks. I think that's the one that sticks out in my mind. So that's currently missing from Harbor. Yeah, I mean, sure. It depends on how you're using Quay, right? Quay integrates really nicely with some of their product offerings. So I don't know that I want to go out and say like, yeah, you can replace Quay with Harbor. But for the most part, I think the feature gap is relatively small. Yeah, and I'm confident Red Hat will open source Quay too. So, be nice to have another partner in crime here in the CNCF. So I don't know, maybe, but I'm happy to hear about any features that are missing from Harbor that Quay has that we can add it if you'd like to share that feedback.
Cool, thanks. We got two more questions here. So the first one is from AJ Kansei. What is needed to set up a replication? Let me see if I can get this right. What is needed of replication if we set up repos for every environment and control access?
What is needed if we set up? Sorry, repeat it for me one more time.
Yeah. What is needed of replication if we set up repos for every environment and to control access? I believe so. Essentially, what do we need to set up replication for different environments and control access to those environments?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to do it. The UI is perhaps the lowest barrier. If you have, we certainly have users that have so many projects and there's automation around those projects and so on that they use the API to create the projects, delegate access properly, and set up the replication. Again, all API driven. So I guess it depends on how complex your use case is, but it can definitely be done either through the UI or by an API and assume the CLI.
Perfect, thank you. Got a question here from Yusri. What is the difference between Harbor and Portis?
I believe Portis is a way to, okay, so I'll preface this by saying that I have only used Portis once or twice, and it's been a little while. I believe Portis is meant to manage containers, while Harbor is a container registry. I don't think that Portis is a container registry, but honestly, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've touched it. Sorry, I don't know if that answer was very good, but if I am correct, one is meant to manage, one is the UI for Docker, kind of, and the other is a place to put images. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, Jonas.
All right, cool. Last question here from Gabrielle. How are you doing updates for Harbor? And that's Harbor updates. Like, how do you upgrade Harbor from one version to another? And we're actually getting more questions in here. So that was not the last question.
That's okay. Keep them coming. There's a wiki page that talks about it. There's caveats and, as with all software, between every release. For the most part, it's just a script that you run to migrate the schema, the Postgres schema, and then you bring up the new version. So it is sort of a one-way deal. But I guess the specific answer is it depends on what version you're upgrading from and to, but we've certainly made it easier with every release.
Great. Another one from Sanjeev here. Can Harbor and Claire provide a CIS benchmark for Kubernetes checking?
I'm not sure what that is. I'm sorry.
I believe it is the Center for Internet Security. They have a bunch of benchmarks, but I'm not aware of what that is either.
Yeah, ping me on Slack. I don't know the answer, obviously, but yeah, we can figure it out together.
Great, thank you. That was the last question for right now.
Good. All right. Thanks everyone for your time. I'll hand it back to you, Jonas and Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Thanks for doing the Q&A. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to James or Jonas on the CNCF Slack or their GitHub page. And thanks for joining us today. The recording and slides will be available later. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.